Imagine a world shrouded in chaos, where ignorance reigns, cities crumble, and progress grinds to a halt. That's the Dark Ages, right? A grim backward era where Europe wallowed in misery for centuries. Or is it? What if everything you've been told about the Dark Ages is a myth, a story spun by later generations to make themselves look better? Today we're diving into the so-called Dark Ages, roughly 500 to 1000 AD, to uncover why this period wasn't as dark as you think. From groundbreaking innovations to vibrant cultures, we'll explore the hidden truths that challenge the stereotypes. Stick around, because by the end, you'll see this era in a whole new light, and you might even wonder why we ever called it dark at all. Let's start with the big question. Why do we even call this period the Dark Ages? The term comes from 14th century Italian scholars, like Petrarch, who looked back at the centuries after Rome's fall and saw a cultural wasteland. They were obsessed with classical Greece and Rome. Think marble statues, grand aqueducts, and philosophers debating in togas. To them, the period after Rome's collapse in 476 AD seemed like a step backward, a time when Europe lost its shine. But here's the catch. Those scholars were biased. They were comparing their own Renaissance era with its art and learning to a time they barely understood. It's like judging a book by its cover without reading a single page. And that judgment stuck, painting the early Middle Ages as a time of stagnation. But was it really? To answer that, let's set the scene. Picture Europe in 500 AD. The Western Roman Empire is gone, shattered by invasions and internal strife. Cities like Rome, once bustling with 1 million people, are shrinking. Trade routes are disrupted, and warlords carve out petty kingdoms. Sounds bleak, doesn't it? But even in this chaos, something remarkable was happening. People weren't just surviving. They were adapting, innovating, and laying the foundations for modern Europe. The Dark Ages weren't a void. They were a bridge between the ancient world and the medieval world we often romanticize, with its castles and knights. So let's debunk the myths one by one and shine a light on what was really going on. First, let's tackle the idea that the Dark Ages were a cultural black hole. The stereotype is that after Rome fell, Europe forgot how to read, write, or think. Schools shut down, libraries burned, and everyone just grunted at each other in the mud. Not quite. While it's true that the centralized Roman education system collapsed, learning didn't vanish, it transformed. In Ireland, far from the chaos of the continent, monks in remote monasteries were busy preserving ancient texts. Places like the monastery at Iona became beacons of scholarship, copying everything from Roman poetry to Greek philosophy. These weren't just dusty old books. They were the seeds of Western knowledge, carefully tended by men who saw their work as a sacred duty. But it wasn't just preservation. These monks were creating. Take the Book of Kells, a 9th century manuscript from Ireland. It's not just a Bible, it's a masterpiece of art, with intricate designs that rival anything from Rome's peak. Each page bursts with color, from swirling spirals to fantastical beasts, all drawn by hand with quills and homemade ink. This wasn't the work of a backward people, it was a cultural triumph, proof that creativity thrived even in tough times. And Ireland wasn't alone. In Anglo-Saxon England, scholars like Bede were writing histories that are still studied today. His Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written in the 8th century, is a detailed account of England's early Christian era, blending facts with storytelling in a way that feels almost modern. Now you might be thinking, okay, monks were doing cool stuff, but what about everyone else? Weren't most people just peasants toiling in the dirt? Well, yes, life was hard for many. Most Europeans were farmers, working land owned by lords in a system that would later evolve into feudalism. But even here, the Dark Ages were far from stagnant. Let's talk about agriculture, because this is where the era starts to shine. Around the 6th century, farmers across Europe began using a new tool, the heavy plough. Unlike the light ploughs of Roman times, which were fine for Mediterranean soil, the heavy plough could tackle the dense clay-rich soils of northern Europe. It had a curved blade that turned the earth, making farming more efficient and allowing people to grow more food. This wasn't just a random gadget. It was a game changer. More food meant bigger populations, which meant villages could grow into towns. By the 8th century, Places like Paris and Aachen were becoming hubs of trade and power. The heavy plough also needed oxen to pull it, which led to another innovation, the horse collar. This padded harness let horses pull heavier loads without choking, making them more useful for farming and transport. Suddenly, goods could move faster, connecting far-flung regions. These inventions didn't just keep people fed, they set the stage for Europe's economic recovery. So, while the Roman Empire's roads were crumbling, medieval farmers were quietly revolutionizing how the world worked. But what about technology beyond the farm? The Dark Ages are often portrayed as a time when science and engineering took a nap. Yet this era gave us some surprising advancements. Take the watermill, for example. Romans had used watermills, but they were rare and clunky. By the 7th century, watermills were popping up across Europe, grinding grain, sawing wood, and even forging iron. In some regions, like modern-day France, entire villages were built around these mills, which saved hours of back-breaking labor. The Domesday Book, a survey of England from 1086, records over 6,000 watermills in England alone. That's not the sign of a society stuck in the mud. It's evidence of ingenuity and growth. Another myth we need to bust is that the Dark Ages were all about violence and chaos. Yes, there were invasions. Vikings, Magyars, and others caused plenty of trouble. But this wasn't just mindless destruction. The Vikings, for instance, weren't just raiders. They were traders and explorers who connected Europe to distant lands. Their longships reached as far as Constantinople and even North America, centuries before Columbus. In 860 AD, a Viking named Rurik founded a settlement that would become the precursor to Russia. These were people building networks, not just burning villages. And while kings and warlords fought for power, they were also creating stability. Take Charlemagne, the Frankish king crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD. He united much of Western Europe from France to Germany, creating a mini-renaissance of art, law, and education. Charlemagne's court at Aachen was a hub of learning where scholars from across Europe gathered to study and debate. He standardized weights and measures, making trade easier, and promoted a new script called Carolingian minuscule, which made writing clearer and faster. This script is the ancestor of the lowercase letters you're reading right now. Charlemagne also built schools, insisting that clergy and nobles learn to read and write. This wasn't a man presiding over a dark age. He was a visionary trying to rebuild a fractured world. His empire didn't last long after his death, but its legacy shaped Europe for centuries, from the idea of a unified Christian continent to the foundations of modern France and Germany. Let's pause for a moment to address religion, because it's another area where the Dark Ages get a bad rap. Some people imagine this era as a time when the Church stifled free thought, chaining Europe to superstition. But the reality is more complex. Christianity was a unifying force, giving people a shared identity in a fragmented world. Monasteries weren't just places for prayer, they were economic powerhouses, running farms, mills, and even early hospitals. Monks and nuns cared for the sick, preserved knowledge, and experimented with new farming techniques. In places like Cluny, France, monastic reforms in the 10th century sparked a wave of spiritual and cultural renewal that spread across Europe. The Church also inspired art and architecture that still awe us today. Think of the early medieval churches, like the ones in Ravenna, Italy, with their glittering mosaics. These weren't crude buildings, they were statements of faith and skill, blending Roman, Byzantine, and local styles. The Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, though built just before the Dark Ages, influenced architects across Europe, who adapted its domes and arches into their own designs. This was an era of experimentation, where builders learned to work with stone in ways that would later lead to the soaring Gothic cathedrals of the High Middle Ages. Far from stifling creativity, the Church was often its biggest patron. Now let's talk about trade, because the Dark Ages weren't as isolated as you might think. While Roman trade networks took a hit, new ones emerged. The Franks traded with the Byzantine Empire, exchanging furs and slaves for silk and spices. The Anglo-Saxons shipped wool to the continent, laying the groundwork for England's later textile industry. And then there were the Arabs, who controlled much of the Mediterranean after the 7th century. Their conquests didn't cut Europe off. They opened new markets. By the 9th century, Arab merchants were selling European amber and furs as far away as Baghdad, while bringing back gold, textiles, and scientific knowledge. This brings us to another key point. The Dark Ages weren't just a European story. While Europe was finding its feet, the Islamic world was thriving, and the two were deeply connected. In Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, cities like Cordoba were global, centers of learning, with libraries that dwarfed anything in Christian Europe. Scholars there translated Greek and Roman texts, adding their own insights in fields like mathematics and astronomy. These ideas slowly filtered into Europe, especially through Sicily and Spain, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived side by side. The astrolabe, a tool for navigation and astronomy, was refined by Muslim scholars and adopted by European sailors. So while Europe was rebuilding, it wasn't cut off from the world. It was part of a global exchange that kept ideas flowing. But let's zoom back to Europe and address the elephant in the room. Life wasn't exactly easy. Disease, famine, and war were real threats. The average lifespan was shorter than today, though not as dire as some exaggerate. Many people lived into their 50s or 60s if they survived childhood. Sanitation wasn't great, and medical knowledge was limited, often mixing herbal remedies with prayer. Yet, even here, there's evidence of progress. Archaeological digs show that people ate a varied diet, from grains and vegetables to meat, and fish depending on their status. And while cities shrank, they didn't disappear. Places like York in England and Mainz in Germany remained active, with markets and churches that drew people together. So why does the Dark Ages myth persist? Part of it is storytelling. The Renaissance scholars who coined the term wanted to hype their own era, so they downplayed the centuries before. Later, Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire piled on, portraying the Middle Ages as a time of fanaticism and ignorance, to contrast with their age of reason. Even today, pop culture loves the gritty, grim version of the past. Think muddy villages and marauding bandits in movies. But history isn't that simple. The early Middle Ages were a time of transition, not collapse. They were messy, sure, but they were also dynamic, with people finding new ways to live, work, and create. Let's reflect on what we've uncovered. The Dark Ages gave us the heavy plough and watermill, which transformed farming and industry. Monks preserved and created knowledge, producing works of art, like the Book of Kells. Charlemagne built an empire that planted the seeds of modern Europe. Trade networks, from Viking longships to Arab merchants, kept goods and ideas moving. And the Church, far from being a straitjacket, fostered art, education, and community. This wasn't a dark age, it was a crucible, forging the world we know today. So what can we take away from this? First, question the labels history hands you. The term Dark Ages is catchy, but it's misleading, shaped by biases that don't hold up under scrutiny. Second, appreciate the resilience of people in tough times. The men and women of this era didn't have it easy, but they built, innovated, and dreamed just like we do. Finally, think about how this connects to today. We often look back at the past and see only its flaws, but every era has its light and shadow. The early Middle Ages remind us that even in chaos, humanity finds a way to move forward. If you've enjoyed this journey through the so-called Dark Ages, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Did anything surprise you? Maybe you've got a favorite medieval myth you want debunked. And if you found this video eye-opening, give it a like and share it with a friend who loves history. Better yet, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next dive into the past. Speaking of which, we're tackling another fascinating topic soon. Hidden medieval inventions that amaze medieval tech. You won't believe the ingenious creations that came out of this era. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.